Good morning and welcome to Praxis Peace Institute's online forum. I'm Georgia Kelly, the director of Praxis, and today we are most fortunate to host a true expert on Russian and Eastern European history and politics. Joining us from Canterbury, England, Richard Sakwa is a British political scientist and a professor emeritus from the University of Kent in Canterbury. He is the author of several books on the region, including Deception, Russiagate and the New Cold War, Frontline Ukraine, Crisis in the Borderlines, and The Lost Peace, How the West Failed to Prevent a Second Cold War. Today, we are discussing his latest book, which is actually being published tomorrow, will be available, and it's called The Russia-Ukraine War, Follies of Empire, which is an extraordinary book. And if you want a detailed but still highly readable account of the history and politics of this region, there is no better book I could suggest than this one. So you can order it directly from the publisher, and I will put that information in the chat box. And I'll also send it out later on with the recorded version of this interview today. So welcome, Richard. It's just wonderful to have you back with us.
It's my pleasure to be with you, and thank you very much for these kind introduction.
Oh, I could say a lot more, but I want to get to the questions. And before I do get to the questions, I just want to let everybody know that I have interviewed Richard twice before. And when I send the recording link out to those of you tonight, I will include the links for those interviews because I don't want to repeat the questions that we've already explored in previous interviews. So I just wanted to let you all know that. And my first question today to you, Richard, is actually to look at some of the history before we get into details. And one of the chapters in your book is called The Road to War, which I thought is a really interesting title and kind of gives us a way into this interview. I'd like you to give us
Do you want to listen? I've got it on my.
This is the problem. All right, I'll go back to the question. So, the road to war. I'd like us to have an overview from you on some of the key events since the dissolution of the USSR. I think at this point we don't need to go back further than that, but some of the things that happened after the end of the USSR that led to the current war in Ukraine, and specifically look at the roles of NATO and the US, and also how far back the US was involved with Ukraine.
When I was thinking about the sort of questions you may ask this evening, well, for us this evening, today, I was thinking precisely to go the other way than you've suggested just now, and how far back to go. And while just a few minutes ago, I was thinking intensely that in some ways we have to go back all the way to 1945, that in some ways the Russo-Ukrainian conflict, which we are deeply embroiled in at the moment, has its roots go back to the very post-war settlement, because obviously the 80 years since 1945 represent a defined period of historical time. But that historical time, the contradictions and tensions which have been right embedded in it right from the start of 1945. Obviously, this year I was nearly used the word celebrating, but certainly marking Winston Churchill's famous Fulton, Missouri speech, the Cold War speech, Iron Curtain speech, and so on. So that in some ways, the very beginning of the post-war settlement is unraveling, including, unfortunately, the establishment of the United Nations and the whole Charter international system. It's all falling apart now, including the Russo-Ukrainian war. It's a long story, but I just wanted to identify one element in particular. Well, two. One is the failure right after Yalta Potsdam to settle the German question. And that's very relevant to what we're talking today, because clearly the Soviet Union was hoping for a neutral Germany in the center of Europe and a united Germany under, clearly under four-power control for the early years. This was implicitly part of the Yalta-Potsdam deal. And in fact, very soon afterwards, the Western powers reneged on it. Stalin again in 1952 came up with the idea, and Khrushchev again. We now see from the archives that these plans were genuine. That, in other words, the settlement of the European security architecture, which has never still not been resolved 80 years after the end of the Second World War, was there were genuine, that the idea of a neutral, demilitarized Germany was at the heart of the a possible alternative model. Unfortunately, it didn't come about. Instead of which, we saw after 1945 the establishment of what the Russians like to call the collective West. I call the political West. Westerners like to call the Atlantic Alliance system. Doesn't matter what you call it, this powerful US Western European alliance system with Japan and Australasian countries part of it as well. That it was this political West which, after 1989 and the collapse of the Soviet Union, claimed to be universal. It claimed to have its values, and it claimed to be the victor, of course. It also claimed to be what history would look like after history has ended, and all of that discussion and so on. All of that is fundamental background to this war. After 1989, collapse of the Soviet Union, emergence of an independent Russia. Russia is, of course, and always has been, a European state. But the debate has always been how to define Europe. What sort of Europe are we going to have? And the United States, after 1945, shaped an Atlanticist Europe. Now, Russia, by definition, is going to be concerned with a sort of a more pan-continental Europe, one, as de Gaulle put it, from Lisbon, well, others and Gorbachev, Lisbon to Vladivostok, a larger vision. That is the fundamental war contest, which is continuing to this day, and focus, that contradiction, is on Ukraine. And it was always going to be, because of its location and because of the peculiar role it was always, a distinctive, by peculiar I mean distinctive part it was going to play in all of these contexts. And of course, it was explicitly stated by Zbigniew Brzezinski, Jimmy Carter's national security advisor, a virulent Russophobe, who helped shape Clinton's policies from the Polish community and so on. That these were people who would never allow Russia to emerge as, in any way, when I say hegemonic, I don't mean dominant or post or neo-imperial, a force which could be at the center of post-Soviet unification or unity of the post-Soviet states to maintain economic, cultural, human pension links, and so on after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the collapse of the Soviet bloc. They were not going to allow this to happen. And all of these contradictions come to shape. And so, in other words, NATO enlargement and all the rest is epiphenomenal, is secondary to that larger picture. NATO could enlarge. Why not? If it was going to be embedded in a larger pan-European security order. Even Brzezinski made that argument. Sorry, that was a long answer, but I really do think that, as you say, the Russo-Ukrainian war isn't just a contingent element. And one of the models is that it was simply Russian imperialism is always going to be there, and it was always going to seek revenge, or Russia is an autocratic dictatorship, and it couldn't stand the sight of a democratic Ukraine, so therefore had to invade. That's, if you put it into this larger context, it's quite clear those arguments, they play a part, but they're not central to the issue.
Right. One of the things that I noted in an article that I wrote recently about this is that the time of the dissolution of USSR, there were only 12 countries that had NATO troops in it, but today there are 32 countries. And supposedly the Cold War ended, and here we are with, almost 3 times as many countries having NATO troops in them. One thing I want to go to, because it's never in the media here, is what was going on in Ukraine in terms of a civil war before Putin invaded. And we don't really hear about that. And I think most people I would talk to in America have no idea that there was a civil war going on. So I'd like you to talk a little bit about where it was happening, who was involved, and what populations were in the region that were fighting at the time before Putin invaded.
Yeah. One of the other fundamental this we've talked about the long-term historical factors, but a no less important issue is indeed the domestic or contest over Ukrainian nation and state building. And right from the beginning, there's been a beginning of independence in 1991, but even obviously with deeper roots into Ukrainian history, there have been two visions. On the one side, you have the more generous vision of a pluralistic, multi-confessional, multilingual, culturally tolerant, open society. This is put forwards by people like Vyacheslav Chornovil in the 1990s and all the way through. By contrast, you had this alternative vision, which was a decolonial, post-colonial vision that Ukraine had been under Muscovite and then later Russian imperial and Soviet domination, but that there was this sort of, if you like, a type of core ethnic and national Ukrainian identity, which has to get rid of its overlay of Russian language, Russian culture, Soviet culture, communism, all of that, a negative vision. I call this the monist or single vision, and that is effectively one language, one culture, one people. It was clearly going to be generate conflict. And of course, even though this monist vision can, at the margin, be very generous, because anybody who buys into that vision, you can be Jewish, you can be Hungarian, you can be Polish, it doesn't matter. If you buy into that narrow vision of Ukrainian statehood, then you are in as part of that community. So, in other words, and as you may have seen, my book is dedicated to the other Ukraine. This is the one which wants to be pluralistic. And of course, unfortunately, most of its representatives are either abroad or dead at the moment and internally suppressed violently, as you can see. So, this civil war element, right from the beginning, the Ukraine was going to be the cockpit of the unresolved contradictions of European security and of this Second Cold War, US ambitions for maintaining the Atlantic alliance system in a Cold War format. So, and of course, the tensions came to a head over European Union enlargement in 2013, 2014, leading to the Maidan events, that is what Ukrainians like to call the Revolution of Dignity. Others simply call it a coup d'etat, in which those ethno-nationalists came to power. And after February 2014, Ukraine has been dominated by this narrow vision of Ukrainian statehood. Immediately after that, there were uprisings. Crimea was one thing. And in the Donbass, you had those who had long been opposed to NATO membership, had long been a largely Russophone population. And they protested in part with support from Moscow, but it was really an indigenous revolt. But it was Ukraine which started the war in April 2014 in attacking its own people, sending in rockets, planes, bombing, and violent repression, instead of negotiating with what were then at that stage simply demands for autonomy, for federalism. And just like many other countries have this, Canada with Quebec, United Kingdom now semi-federal with Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland. But instead of debating it, they decided to suppress it with the support of the Western powers. Again, the double standards. So in the Donbass, you had, and very quickly, an internationalized civil war. And in a sense, what happened in February 22 when Russia invaded. It was just simply a broadening out. But the fact that all those years Russia was willing to accept the details of the Minsk Accords, this is the attempt to put an end to that civil war in September 2014 and again in February 2015, which was a way of restoring the Donbass to Ukrainian sovereignty as long as they allowed a measure of devolution. And this, the ethno-nationalists in power refused to accept. And we now know that the Western powers, and in fact, it was the Minsk Accords were given status of international law because it was adopted by the United Nations. But we now know that Angela Merkel in Germany, François Hollande in France, never intended to, as the co-guarantors of this deal, to go along with it. And it was Putin who was the only one willing to accept this. If Russia really was this imperialist power, it could have annexed those parts of the Donbass any time after 2014. It didn't do so. It was willing to restore. Of course, the Ukrainians would say, you would if we gave devolution to the Donbass, then they would act as a veto on our ability to join NATO and so on. But so it's always this obsession to join NATO. Joining NATO is an attempt to avert a security catastrophe, but the very intention of doing so precisely precipitated the catastrophe it was designed to avert. You couldn't make it up,
Right.
unfortunately.
I want to spend just a little more time on NATO before we go on to something else, because I really want to get into some other areas. But one thing you mentioned in your book is that NATO was in long preparation for war between Russia and Ukraine, the proxy war that we are now seeing, and that they were training up to 10,000 troops a year in Ukraine. And when did this begin? I wasn't sure when this began, that NATO began training troops in Ukraine. And so I'd like you to expand on that a little bit, because none of this information, again, is in our media. So I'd like you to tell us when that began and how extensive that preparation was.
Yeah, this is, if you like, NATO enlargement by stealth. The majority of the Ukrainian population opposed membership in NATO all the way through, even to 2018, well after the so-called Revolution of Dignity. Uh, NATO initially, way back into the 1990s, in 1997, for example, a NATO forces were, and a military exercise had landed in the Crimea. And amazingly enough, the local population came out with pitchforks and said, "Go away, we don't want you here." But of course, the Western powers, the political West, wasn't going to take no for an answer. And very soon after that, they established a training base, a famous one, Yavoriv, in Western Ukraine. And from the early 2000s, even though formal membership or discussion of Ukraine joining NATO only really was confirmed at the Bucharest summit in April 2008. But at that same time, even though they didn't give a membership action plan, they were so in other words, Ukraine was not in NATO, but NATO, as you say, was in Ukraine from a long time back, effectively from the early 2000s, and by various surreptitious means began under Clinton. Bush Jr. then continued it. Obama, of course, did nothing about that and accelerated it and intensified it. Trump, of course, in his contradictory manner, in 2016 to 2020, did nothing to stop it. In fact, provided lethal weapons to Ukraine and started building up armed forces. So when Trump later on said this was Biden's war, well, Mr. Trump, no, in part it was you who escalated under pressure of elements, but I mean of course, Trump's policies are not entirely consistent, but it provided stingers and missiles, which Obama refused to do because Obama, if you remember, had argued that, first of all, Ukraine was not a core US interest, and second, that Moscow would always have what he called escalation dominance.
Okay, now I'm going to go to what I consider one of the saddest situations related to this war, and that is the peace agreement that almost happened and that you read extensively about in this book. Within 2 months of the start of the war, really in April, already there were negotiations happening in the Belarus and then finally in Istanbul, and this is kind of the one I want you to talk about. And you wrote that they were close to 90% in agreement in Istanbul. And I'd like you to tell us what happened when Boris Johnson decided to go and try to sabotage these talks. What happened with that agreement? Where could it have gone? And why was it destroyed?
Mm.
And who
Uh,
destroyed it?
yeah, the that actually takes us to the question: what really were Putin's strategic goals in launching the dreadful invasion on the 24th of February 2022. We have to go back to the planned European Security Treaty of December 2021, which the two treaties, one with NATO, one with the United States, interestingly enough, not one with Europe, which is again another sign of our marginal and subaltern status. But you could argue the whole exercise was a massive exercise of coercive diplomacy. The goal was to achieve that, well, a very ambitious goal of changing Ukrainian state policy, to changing its very nature of state building, to become that more pluralistic, tolerant, and indeed to go back to the founding documents of Ukrainian statehood, the Declaration of State Sovereignty in July 1990, later on many other documents, but in the Constitution, that Ukraine would be a non-aligned state, and that was crucial. And so that's a framework in which, after the war began, Putin and the Moscow strategic planners nearly achieved their goal, which was a political diplomatic goal. It was not the submission or destruction of Ukraine or anything like this. It was to make Ukraine what it initially said it would be, and one of the conditions for independence at the Bielovesia, when the Soviet Union was formally I nearly said destroyed, but disaggregated in December 1991 at the Bielovesia Agreement of Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia, was the condition was that Ukraine would be neutral and non-aligned. It was nearly achieved, and that was the heart of this peace deal within 2 months, as I say, the end of the war. And it won't go into all the details, but it was to go back to that position effectively. It was also going to achieve cultural pluralism, and that's, in other words, multilingualism, neutrality, limits to Ukrainian armed forces, and all of that. The idea that we were 90% is one put forward by what was then a main advisor to President Volodymyr Zelensky, Alexei Arestovich. He said we were 90% there. He even said we'd almost prepared to take out the champagne and drink to the end of the war by the communique at the end of March and the deal by the 15th of April. However, as you say, already on the 24th of March, NATO met, leaders met, and they said, we will not establish or provide any security guarantees for any peace deal. In other words, we would not underwrite any peace deal, which was already basically a sentence of, Ukraine would find it very difficult to go ahead without Western backing to support the peace deal. They call it security guarantees, but call it what could be called many things. But there was to underwrite the peace deal. Already 24th of March, Biden specially made an effort to make sure that this was going to happen. And Boris Johnson, of course, in the middle of negotiations, turned up in Kiev on the 9th of April and said to Zelensky, guys, you can't trust Putin, no deal. And basically the idea was, if you, that is, the Ukrainians, continue to fight, we will provide you with support, the weapons, and so on for you to do it. In other words, that's where the famous statement of the Western powers will fight to the last Ukrainian, and that effectively remains Boris Johnson's policy to this day. You keep fighting, we'll pay the money, and in other words, you'll bog Russia down in this war, its own Vietnam, if you like, and then we will make it and destroy it as a great power, and it obviously has no bandwidth to support Venezuela, Cuba, Iran, whatever, while we continue our adventures elsewhere. So, but there was a peace deal, and that is why Russia invaded with a minuscule force. This is not to denigrate or minimize the suffering and tragedy of these events, by no means. But nevertheless, the force is roughly 150,000 men. against what everybody knew was a Ukrainian armed force of at least 240,000 with 500,000 reservists. Plus, of course, if your country is invaded, you will have obviously popular mobilization, obviously to defend your homeland. And the idea that there were going to be Russophone elements coming out with flowers to welcome the liberating forces was always a fantasy put out by Viktor Medvedchuk and others, Ukrainians, who had gone to Moscow. But most people understood, and I say in the book, with Viktor Medvedchuk, this is the Ukrainian oligarch, very close to Putin and the Russian leadership, as everybody says, with Medvedchuk, if he says it's sunny outside, you better rush to the window and you'll probably need to get your umbrella out very quickly. So that was unlikely. But the idea of 150,000 troops was an attempt to precipitate the to aid this coercive diplomacy. It was foolish and ill thought out. There's no question about it. It was too much for an attempt to establish diplomatic pressure, and far too little for a genuine. I mean, I have in mind the invasion of Czechoslovakia on the 21st of August 1968, where over 500,000 Soviet troops plus Allied forces from the Warsaw Pact, and it took months of planning. This invasion was launched with minimal planning, minimal diplomatic support. Even the Russian people were simply astonished by it, could hardly believe it when it took place. So, even though, of course, it had been saber rattling for months in advance. Yeah. But in other words, peace was there, peace was sabotaged, and it has been. European leaders continue to this day. I mean, we can say many things about Donald J. Trump, but his genuine attempts to act as a mediator, because this is a war he's not interested in, he says, and when he came to power with the MAGA coalition, which was to focus on domestic policies and to put an end to the Ukraine war. He said that 53 times during his electoral campaign, that he would put an end to the war. Sometimes he said within 24 hours, sometimes longer, sometimes shorter. He was genuine about this, and he has been. He has been. Though, of course, sending out Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner is not, when you've got trained diplomats in the State Department, if they haven't been fired, that is, who should be doing this.
Right. Yeah, a lot of them have been fired. I do have two more questions that I quickly want to get to before I open it up for audience questions. But one is to just go back to the 2014 coup where Yanukovych was removed from power. And the American organizations that were involved in that, and certainly and wrote about Victoria Nuland and Joe Biden, who were very involved in supporting that coup. And the National Endowment for Democracy, which I've always called the CIA front, was very involved in that. And I wanted to know if you had anything you'd like to add to what they were doing in trying to bring down a democratically elected president in Ukraine.
Yeah. Again, I'm sorry to go on always to go back into the deep roots of it, but the United States in the 1990s had a huge embassy in Kiev. At some points into the early 2000s, we're talking about 500, 600, 700 staff members. And of course, many of them were from the National Endowment and various supporting NGOs and all the stuff. Many of them were doing very good work. So one shouldn't just brush everything, because USAID maybe it was the good, the bad, and the ugly, which it was involved with. Some of the good was very good, the bad was very bad in the regime change, and the ugly was very unpleasant in distorting domestic politics. That's what they were doing, these people. And of course, the US embassy was there, devoted to one thing mainly, to ensure that Russia and Ukraine did not get on well together, to constantly poison these relations. Well, they jolly well succeeded in that, to the catastrophe, not just for Ukrainian people, the Russian people, Europe as a whole, and for global politics in general. As you say, this goes back all the way, because after this is the way the 1945 peace or settlement emerged, then how we focused, in my view now, beginning to see too much on the end of the Soviet Union, 1989, the end of the Cold War, debates over NATO enlargement, 1991, collapse of the Soviet Union. All of that is hugely important. But in a sense, how why the United States decided after 1991 that Russia would be excluded. Jeffrey Sachs and others have written about this, but there's enormous literature about how quite explicitly they were not going to let Russia join the political West. They couldn't, because Russia just it wouldn't just simply mean displacing US dominance over the Atlantic alliance system. It would also mean a genuine reshifting in orientation, because it would mean European pan-continentalism comes into play, given the fact of Russia's enormous size. As you know, of course, 74% of the population lives what's called Central Russia, European Russia, relatively low population beyond the Urals and Siberia. So it's a huge European power, and it would force a huge strategic and intellectual, conceptual redefinition. And that's why Washington understood this. What Washington understood, Moscow failed to understand, and only after a few years, even Putin began to understand it, that Russia could not join this political West. And that is why they greeted Donald J. Trump, because he doesn't particularly like NATO either. We now, not for any positive reasons, but clearly because his model is simple, brute power politics rather than one guided by international law, or even by a genuine sense of US national interests, of the sort that the old-fashioned conservatives would like to see formulated, let alone the left. So, sorry to go on about that, but it was uh, it's what they were doing, this embassy with the National Endowment for Democracy and so on. It was simply reflecting the pattern of US politics, policies since 1940, well, since the onset of the Cold War, 1946, 47.
Yeah, that's exactly the kind of track I wanted to hear. I've got so many questions, and I know I have to stop. But I wanted to mention something that I told you about before we began today, which is our media bias. And I think you mentioned in the book that 93% of US media outlets really show an anti-Russia bias and have for many, many years. And usually we get no history and no context with, the bias is just presented. And as I mentioned, there was a poster I saw on Facebook yesterday that said, if Russia stops fighting, there will be no war. If Ukraine stops fighting, there will be no Ukraine. And this is the kind of simplistic black or white scenario with no talk of negotiations, because that's kind of become a bad word in our country. But it's exactly the bias that stops all questioning and all inquiry about what is really behind the war. And I just want to know if you have a few words to say about this kind of bias and how it's affecting not just nationally, but internationally, how this is affecting people's perception and what might be done about it.
There's a number of things going on. One way in which you could describe that is Russophobia, which has got deep roots, in particular in the United Kingdom, interestingly enough. But in the United States, there is this, extraordinary Russophobic strain, which is interesting because obviously Russia helped US become independent in the first place, and of course in the Civil War, it also against the British was, helped. Shield the North in part. So, and of course, there were at various points allies in the Second World War. So there's Russophobia, but there's also the other side of it as well, which gives hope. That clearly within the United States is such a dynamic public sphere that things can change. In fact, this Russophobia is far more deeply embedded in the United Kingdom. But still, this strain, as you say, of personalizing this war and personalizing politics to the demonization of an individual, Khomeini, Assad, Gaddafi, and now Putin. And, endlessly, we've got to stop Putin. Well, Putin is a reflection, and if it wasn't Putin, then you would have Shmutin, and Shmutin would be far worse than Putin in all sorts of respects, almost certainly the successor, because it's Russia. And we are talking about Russian strategic culture. We're talking about a country that has been invaded from the Mongols by the Swedes, by the Poles. The Poles occupied one of the few The Poles occupied Moscow from 1610 to 1612, for example. And then, of course, you had the Swedish War, Poltava. Then you had, well, the French invasion and the German invasions, and so on. So clearly, Russia doesn't have the privilege of two giant oceans to protect it. And it's got no natural defensive borders. This doesn't justify anything, but it helps explain the strategic culture and the sense of threat and fear always out there. So, as you say, it's empathy means understanding and putting yourself in the position of the other. That doesn't mean to sympathize with it, perhaps opposite, even sometimes by empathizing, you can understand it and have a better critique and a better dialogue. And so those D words, dialogue and diplomacy, have completely disappeared from the lexicon of the political West. It became hermetic. And even now in Europe, we've been talking endless peace negotiations with each other. So you have negotiations in Switzerland with Ukraine and the Western powers discussing peace. Whereas they usually call me old-fashioned that you'd have peace talks. You usually have those competence. Just one other element, and that is the coarsening of public discourse. In the United States, just look at the language of Pete Hegseth, for example, which is, well, I don't want to insult American leaders, but I could say it's coarse and it's vulgar. And it's simplistic and it's very dangerous if you have such linguistic degradation that is simply a reflection of an intellectual decline amongst the leadership class, in this particular one dominant. You may say J.D. Vance is far more sophisticated, and I think he is, the author elsewhere. So you do have people there. You have Tulsi Gabbard, who is a far more sophisticated and complicated figure. So it's not, entirely there, but nevertheless, there's coarsening of diplomacy, coarsening of debate. Therefore it forecloses diplomatic options, and that's why tragically it looks like this war will continue for a considerable period of time. We're no closer to peace now than we were, well, a long time ago. So there's no end in sight at the moment.
Yeah, it reminds me of what we were just talking about, our leadership. There was a film that came out many years ago called Idiocracy. Definitely worth looking at again if you haven't seen it. Okay, the last thing I want to ask is, and you started to answer it already, is how does this war end? What do you see as any realistic solutions to it in near or far future? And then I'll open it up for other questions.
Yeah. Both sides have hoped for the collapse of the other side. On the one side, you had certainly Zelensky. Now, this has made this quite explicit that either you assassinate Putin, they attempt to do so in late December with Trumpian guidance, by the way, because clearly 91 drones sent to Valdai, the residence of Putin, we now know were the guidance systems of the CIA involved there. So basically, you'd have a decapitation move as per Khomeini's murder on the 28th of February this year. That's one side of it. So the other side is that the Ukrainian regime, that the Zelensky government will collapse. Clearly, there's bitter tensions within it. At the moment, this is in a war of attrition. And of course, military technology has changed. Now, Ukrainian drones, and of course, Russian ones as well, have a devastating range. Until just a few months ago, military analysts were telling me and telling everyone that there was a 30-mile kill zone on either side of the front line. Lately, given the technological developments, it's 90 miles. And at the same time, Ukraine is launching hundreds, if not thousands, of drones into Russia. Just recently, several dozen were sent towards Moscow last week. And of course, they've been attacking the Turk Stream and the Blue Stream gas pipeline compressor stations towards the Black Sea. So this war is escalating. The Ukrainian war is no longer a regional war. It's becoming a larger European continental war, just like the Iran war is becoming a larger Middle Eastern war. And these two wars are gradually overlapping. And in the end, they will coalesce. And then so in other words, there's only bad thing. It's going to get bad before it gets even badder. And these wars will coalesce and will then go up the escalation ladder towards Third World War. That's where we are, unless somewhere there's nobody talking sense. Bart de Wever, the Belgian Prime Minister, said it's time to talk to Russia. Uh, Even Alexander Stubb, the president of Ukraine, of Finland, a virulent Russophobe who's been dedicatedly driving Finland to NATO membership for 30 years, and he was regarded as a marginal, dangerous figure. Now he's the president of Finland, and repudiating Finlandization, even though it's a very positive element in all sorts of ways. Even these people are saying it's time for dialogue. But it's important to note the reaction of the other European Union leaders, which has been to denigrate and to say, you guys are nuts. We can't talk to Russia. Can't, they don't say even Russia. They say can't talk to Putin. They don't say Russia. And that's important in and of itself. As I say, Putin himself is under huge pressure to escalate. I've talked to some people in Russia, and when I say Russia seems to be fighting, just to see how the reaction, with one hand tied behind its back. This is the criticism of the military bloggers and hardliners within Russia. And they say, no, Russia's fighting this war with two hands behind its back. Why doesn't it unleash and to do to Ukraine what Israel and the United States are doing to Iran? And that's where the debate is at the moment. We need to escalate, because the longer this goes on, the more it gives illusions to Sturmer and Macron and all the others in Europe that they can win this war. And that's what they're saying. If you've been reading the European press in the last few weeks, Russia is losing this war. Okay, it's been given a boost of resources now that energy prices going up. But that's just a temporary reprieve that we need to up the ante, up the pressure. That's why these two wars will both escalate and probably merge into a much larger war.
This is very, very disturbing, Richard. Yeah, I want to open it up now for people to ask questions if they'd like. I think looking at this war expanding more and then becoming part of a larger war in the Middle East is very, very frightening. Hopefully that something will happen in the meantime, but we don't have the leadership. I think this is the real problem. We don't have leadership that can take this on in a realistic way. We have a kind of macho posturing and hubris, but not leadership.
I'm often asked who in Europe could act as the interlocutor. Sometimes we would mention Giorgia Meloni. Obviously, Viktor Orban in Hungary is facing re-election in 30 days. And of course, he's not trusted by the rest of the European leadership. So we're sometimes looking to see who it could be. Could even be this Belgian Prime Minister. I don't want to be parochial, but even Alexander Stubb, who speaks Russian, who, despite his position, has become more realistic. But none of the major powers, and it seems, as you say, where's the kissing figure, if you like? Not that we particularly want one, but at least he, during the Yom Kippur War, did enormous activity and engaged with Moscow and helped that, because that was a moment in 1973 that could have escalated, and it looked as if it would at one stage, into a genuine, much larger war. And he in part helped to prevent that.
Yeah, what we hear a lot here and what I read and see is that people really think Ukraine can win the war, which
Yes.
just is mind-boggling to me. The only way they could win the war is if we antagonize Russia into the Third World War. I mean, that's what it seems like. And yet there is this kind of naivete around a belief that Ukraine can win. And that's very difficult to talk to people who believe that. I'm looking to see if people want to ask questions. And sometimes it takes a little while. I should have mentioned it earlier. But since I don't see any hands yet, I'm going to ask something else. What would a post-Western alliance look like? You talked a little bit about that in the book, or wrote a little bit about it.
Yes. This one of the interesting times. I hope I'm wrong, by the way, about the escalation of this war. But one of the interesting moments is that After 8 decades since 1945, we're living in a far more open historical situation, far more dangerous one, but a far more open one. So there's possibilities. And that's why I think it's incumbent upon us to provide the conceptual framework, because as John Maynard Keynes said, is that it's those ideas which are lying in or incipient, which then at the right moment burst into are seized and then used to shape the course of historical development. And so, as this Atlantic alliance system, this US-led so-called rules-based order, the liberal international order, the Atlantic alliance, the political West, call it what you will, as it disaggregates, the United States, and this isn't just Trump, this is a larger issue about the United States saying, just like Eisenhower said, after 10 years after when NATO was established, if we're still in Europe 10 years later, that was in the mid 50s, then we will have failed. And of course, they've failed most spectacularly. But finally, the thing about Trump is that he's asking some of the right questions, or some of his entourage are. He's obviously not giving the right answers, but he's asking the questions which should have been settled a long time ago, after 1945, after 1989. And they are being asked now in a terrible conjuncture. So people make history, but not in conditions of their choosing, as Karl Marx said. So what would it look like? We're now seeing the United States doing its own thing. It's abandoning the sovereign internationalism at the heart of United Nations Charter system. It's abandoning the liberal globalism that has dominated the political West for so long, but it is reverting to a mercantile, transactional, power-based politics. Might makes right, of course, and that is nothing to be welcomed. But on the other side, Europe is now faced by a challenge of no longer being under US tutelage, vassalage, call it what you will, and it is being forced to take some hard choices. Unfortunately, it is taking the path of militarization as a way of pulling itself out from economic decline, which I think is only exacerbating the problems. So, what a post-American West would look like, it would mean that we move beyond any discussion of the West. Interestingly, of course, the Marco Rubio's speech in at the Munich Security Conference was an astonishing defense of the 500 years of European colonialism and imperialism, which really was astonishing in all sorts of ways. It shows that this political West is a particular moment in the West. I mean, it's transformed the character of the Western states, including the United States. And this is why the old neocons and the paleocons of Patrick Buchanan vintage and so on always come in. By the way, this is one of the astonishing things, is that most of the creative thinking today is coming from the right. And the weakness, I mean, I think it was at Munich, Alexandria Oksana Cortez, AOC,
Yeah.
her speech was astonishing in its militaristic and pro-NATO tone. I mean, I'd like to ask you, so what's all of that? But where's the genuine left peace, anti-militarist talk? I mean, Bernie Sanders, is that all that's left?
Yeah, I think AOC is not that educated on foreign affairs. I think that's part of it. At least that's the sense I got. She seemed like a deer in headlights when she was asked certain questions that
Mm.
she didn't quite know how she wanted to answer it. That's what I felt. I felt she's not sophisticated and educated enough on foreign affairs yet. I think she'll get there. I just don't think she's there yet. And if I don't see questions, I've got more, so I could go on to the end of the hour. The one that I wanted to bring up before was
There is Walter. Sorry,
pardon?
there's Walter. I think has a question.
Oh, okay, go ahead, Walter.
Yeah, I'm just, thank you. I'm just riffing off your remark, Miss Kelly, in regard to the idea that Ukraine would win the war against Russia. I think makes a really good point because there is an absurdity to it. But likewise, then what was Russia actually in fear of uh, and therefore invaded because it was
Mm.
provoked? But just the thought that Ukraine would ever, on its own, and even with some help, be able to defeat Russia I think it makes the point, really.
Mm. Yeah, that's a good, interesting point. Is that many people say, what threat ultimately did Ukraine present to Russia, which needed a Russian response, like this, the dreadful invasion? Is that your question? I think, and it's important. Thank you for that. And you're right. Obviously, Ukraine on its own, but this is where the actions in the months before need to be not just a NATO enlargement and all of that. And even though the in September, then later on in the autumn, the United States and Ukraine signed a defense pact, a treaty, and this entailed ultimately, and this is what the subject. This is why one has to get into the weeds. The one of the two the big one of the final telephone calls between Biden and Putin before the war. I think the penultimate one was on the 30th of December, and this seems to have been forgotten. And the main topic, you think, when I heard it, you read the transcript and so on. Hang on, what's all this about? It was almost all about medium range missiles, Tomahawk missiles. And at that point, it clearly, and this was just crazy. I mean, Biden completely lost the plot, or his advisors. They were planning to install Tomahawk missiles. It wasn't Ukraine on its own, in Ukraine, which means a flight time of 5 minutes to Moscow. Now, this is what the Cuban Missile Crisis was all about. You could say justifiably, John F. Kennedy was not going to allow Soviet missiles, even though it made no difference because they had nuclear submarines, which would have the same business. But you could understand why they weren't going to allow them on Cuba. And I've been arguing that this Ukraine war, in many ways, is a slow motion Cuban missile crisis. And it was the Tomahawk. Then Biden understood, and he said, "Okay, we'll take Tomahawks off the table. Okay, that's not going to happen." Then 2 weeks later, the Blinken met Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, in Geneva. And Lavrov then followed up and says, well, following up on this telephone calls, let's get this down on paper, that no medium range missiles or any missiles, US missiles in Ukraine. And Blinken said, and it's there, black and white, and he said it, admitted it later, that, yeah, so the only thing, no, we can't, we're not going to honor that telephone conversation. And the only thing we can discuss is how many Tomahawk missiles we're going to put into Ukraine. Lavrov was shocked. And then the discussion then continued. And Blinken made this extraordinary, because that's a classic neocon, a liberal, even worse, a liberal neocon. He actually said, Russia, what are you doing in Ukraine? I mean, what's it got to do with you? As if, 1,000 years of history didn't exist. It was just, and Lavrov stormed out. He just says, you simply don't understand. And so, of course, Ukraine on its own wasn't going to invade, but it was also the issue of the Donbass. And so clearly, by then, Ukraine had 60,000 troops, the best troops on the border of the Donbass. And so they were going to do the fear was they would do what Croatia did in Slavonia in 1995. Yeah, so one gets confused between the 19s and the 20s. Or Azerbaijan in Nagorno-Karabakh just months before with drone warfare. So, in other words, we had a security dilemma of unprecedented proportions. And so, of course, there were always alternatives. So, but this isn't to endorse the war. It's to, just like if we're going to explain why Germany did what it did in 1914, it doesn't mean to say endorse the war aims, but you explain what the logic of thinking was. And this is what I've been doing. So I certainly don't endorse any position.
Just a real quick comment, and it's not really a question. You were talking about Russian phobia. There's a great book, Mark Smith, the Russian Anxiety. And although I disagree with some of the points in it, but it also has wonderful sections on the history of Russia, including some wonderful maps. Mark Smith, I'm sure you're familiar. Sorry not to be promoting your book. I did read the other one, but anyway.
No, but the Mark Smith book, The Russian Anxiety, is an excellent book, and certainly people should look at it. Yeah.
Put that in the chat box. And I wanted to talk about your book again, too, the Russia-Ukraine War. And I think it's really important. I put in the chat box the link to, at least I don't see it now, but I did put it in there. And I will send it out to everybody too later on.
Mhm.
And lastly, is there first another question? Because I'll take one more if there is one. And if not, I just want to mention something that I think is really an important part of this and all the wars that we're involved in, is what you called in the book the military industrial ideological complex. That combination and the money that's made off of these wars. I remember when the Soviet Union collapsed and we were, supposed to get that peace dividend. Of course, we never got it. And I remember thinking at the time, what are they going to come up with so that they could keep spending all this money on war machines? And of course, they came up with another Cold War. But this combination of the military, industrial, corporate, ideological, now that they've put that into it, which does away with negotiations, has created kind of a philosophy in a way that is really hard to bust through. And I wonder if you have any comment
Yeah.
about that.
Yeah, I'm so glad you've raised this issue. That's fundamental important. That goes back to this whole idea I talk about, this political West, that it entailed a transformation of its member states. Now, there's a large literature about how the European Union, joining the European Union means a transformation of the European nation state. Chris Bickerton and my former colleague Phil Cunliffe have written about this, that, from nation state to member state. Now, I would like to make, and I now make this argument, that membership of this political West or this Atlantic alliance, military alliance system, including NATO, including European Union, and so much more, has changed the very nature of the American state. Just in other, leaving aside European states, but it's changed the nature. Now, there's a very big literature on this, of course, beginning, always usually starting with a quotation of Eisenhower's farewell speech about the dangers of the military-industrial complex. But also, at the same time, interestingly enough, Harry Truman also made a similar speech warning about the danger of the monster which he'd created, the CIA, and its coups and its all the other stuff it was going on about. Michael Glennon has written an excellent book about the double state in the United States, which I've been talking about the dual state in Russia for years. Basically, the whole political West. So you've got double state in the United States. He talks about the Trumanite state. This is the Cold War military state with a vast penumbra, and this is the ideology of these think tanks, this Atlantic Council, the Henry Jackson Society, a vast, what I think it's called in United States speak, K Street, isn't it? I think, where you have all those, is that K Street?
Lobbyists.
Lobbyists and think
Yeah.
tankers. Then, of course, you have the in-house ones, the Rand Corporation, which in 2019 brought out its document called, what was it called? Stretching Russia, or I've forgot the exact title. But basically, it outlined how to undermine the regime in Russia. It also brought out earlier a document many years earlier on exactly the detail of how you're going to destroy Iran, by the way. So you have this whole conceptual framework. But going back to Michael Glennon, he talks on the one side, the Trumanite state, this national security ideological state. And then you have, he says, the Madisonian state. That is all that nice stuff, Congress, rule of law, the courts, independent courts, all the other stuff. But what Glennon argues, and what I've been arguing elsewhere, is that ultimately it doesn't really matter that you could, and this is why many others have been arguing, you could elect Trump or Stump. It doesn't really make a difference because you have this huge apparatus there, what Ben Rhodes used to call the blob, and I think John Mearsheimer, Stephen Walt from Harvard have described this huge machine, and it cannot be stopped. That this political West changed the nature of the US state itself. Trump didn't like it, and that's one reason why so many people supported it, because they said, why are we spending this money on arms? Why aren't we I don't know the figures about the infrastructure in the United States. I now tell you, when I visit, and I very much like the United States. I'll be going next week to the International Studies Association conference, but you see everywhere exhausted and tired infrastructure. You see it, it's just physical. You can see that this is a country which has not, which doesn't care about, obviously you've got enormous private affluence, as John Kenneth Galbraith said, pub and pr private affluence and public squalor. And that's exacerbated far more since the 1950s, 1960s, when Galbraith initially talked about that. And what are you spending so much on arms now? Next year, what is it? Trump spending to spend $1.5 trillion on defense. So it's a system, it's a machine out of control. It is danger to itself and is a danger to this world. And that is, many people put a hope that Trump, it would take this maverick figure, an outsider, to break this blob, to break the Trumanite state. Unfortunately, he has been captured by the Trumanite state, and you could say they knew it was going to happen anyway. But nevertheless, whatever resistance he was able to put up to it has collapsed now, as we see, with one thing after another. So, how to resist it? That's right. It's usually, but I think the work you guys do is fundamentally important. As long as there are little islands of civilization, civility, the classic ideals of high modernity for dialogue, discourse, debate, peace, then there's still hope.
Yes, there's hope. It's discouraging on many levels, and I think you have pointed out so many of the ideas that we have to grapple with in the book that you've just finished, which I think is one of the most extraordinary books I've ever read, actually. So I'm really amazed at it, and I've learned so much from it, and learned even more today with our interview. So I so appreciate the time you've taken with us, Richard. I really do. It's been extraordinary. And I thank the people who've been on the call and the people who couldn't make it, but we'll get the link later. So if you want to stay on, Richard, I'll show you how to change your background. I'm going to stop the recording now.